This is Behind the Verdict. I'm John Horford with Myrene Cook. And in this episode, we're going to talk about the sentencing. Before we get into that, can you explain to everyone what sentencing guidelines are?
So in Michigan, there are these things called sentencing guidelines that give us a starting point of where a sentence should start. So for example, if there was a felony level charge punishable by a maximum of 10 years imprisonment, a lot of people think, oh, they're going to get 10 years. It doesn't work that way. 10 years is the maximum amount they can do. But you have to run these guidelines, and there are two ways you do it. One is what we call prior record variables. It's their prior criminal history. So they get so many points assessed for 7 different variables, and that gives you a total. On the other side of it, there are things called offense variables, and that's offense specific to what they did in this case they're being sentenced on. And that has a range of up to potentially 20 different variables. And so you take those two amounts and they come together on a grid, and that gives you a starting point. So for example, on that 10-year felony example that I gave, the starting point for a sentence could be somewhere between 29 months to 57 months, and that would be the judge's call to decide where it starts, and then the maximum would be the max for the case itself. So in this example, up to 10 years. So even though Bowman was convicted of murder in the second degree, it is not an automatic life sentence in Michigan. It's any term of years for murder in the second degree. So we still needed to run these sentencing guidelines, but interestingly enough, we needed to run what the sentencing guidelines were in 1989, not what they are currently.
Why?
Because that's when he committed the crime. So any of the laws applicable at the time the crime was committed are applicable at sentencing as well.
And you prefer it that way?
It's legally has to be that way.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a lot of preferences I have that I wish legislators would listen to. But
so what would you prefer?
Well, I think they need to look a lot at the details of what they did, and they do allow us to do that. It's called exceeding the guidelines. But to exceed the guidelines, you've got to have, under the law, a reasonableness for why the guidelines aren't scored accurately enough. What is the horrible, heinous thing that pushes this over the top that says this person should be given a harsher sentence, and why?
Yeah.
Anytime you exceed the guidelines in Michigan, you're looking at probably an automatic appeal most of the time. People are going to appeal that because they have nothing better to do with their time while they're sitting incarcerated than to see if they can pick apart something you did. And this goes back to the beginning of the case. It goes to those search warrants we talked about. It goes to how things were charged and authorized. It goes to how we did the case in court. And they can appeal any of those things. So it's really important that all of that is done to the T while you're investigating a case.
So what changes would you like to see the Michigan legislature make to help protect the people of Michigan?
Oh, John, I don't know that we have enough time for those conversations. There's a lot of things I'd like to see differently.
What's your number one?
Well, my number one is I think there's something out there called truth in sentencing, and I think that should be maintained. Truth in sentencing gives a victim the understanding, the knowledge, and the safety to know that my perpetrator is going to serve this minimum amount of time before they're eligible for parole. There's this new legislation out there that I'm not sure why it passed so far. It's called second look legislation. And it says that basically if a person is convicted of a 10-year crime or more, if they're sentenced to more than 10 years, that's how it's worded. If they're sentenced to more than 10 years, after they serve 10 years, they deserve a second look to see if they should be eligible for parole earlier. Now, I haven't delved into all of the potential exceptions to that, but for example, criminal sexual conduct in the first degree with a child under 13 in Michigan can have a mandatory 25-year minimum sentence. If this is not an exception, that person who perpetrated this crime on, let's say, a 5-year-old, potentially, under this legislation, could be out in 10 years, and that victim is still a minor.
Wouldn't there have to be some evidence to prove that that person was innocent after 10 years for them to be able to get out, though?
Oh, you're not doing it based on their innocence or guilt. You're doing it based on their conduct while incarcerated. Were they good?
That's what it's based on?
Did they have misconducts? Do they deserve a shot to get out? Have they been rehabilitated? Have they made changes in their life to show that they're going to be a productive member of society?
So there are certain crimes that should just absolutely not be considered under this new law if it passes, and has not passed yet because I don't believe that the governor has signed.
Right. There definitely should be exceptions, and maybe there are. Maybe there's something on that I'm not missing, because I'll be honest, once I started reading it and hearing about all of the details, I got angry and put it aside for a few minutes. I didn't want to do anything short-tempered.
We should look into that one and just see. I actually think one of our questions from the audience is about that specific law. But to your point, if it would allow people who have committed violent sexual crimes or, whatever it may be to get out in a decade, I mean, that could have massive ramifications.
The ideas I've heard surrounding this bill were, if someone is convicted of a drug crime, they shouldn't have to serve more than 10 years in prison. To be honest, those sentencing guidelines to get somebody at a level where they are serving more than 10 years in prison, you have to really, really focus on those guidelines and look to see where they're being scored on those variables. If they're able to be scored that high, there's a reason for it. They
were probably violent. They probably did have dangerous weapons. There was something additional added onto it.
Exactly. Exactly. And quite honestly, it's not often that we see someone convicted of drug trafficking generally get more than 10 years.
Really?
It doesn't happen very often.
It's fascinating that you say that, because I was talking with the prosecutor from Eaton County, actually. I don't know if you know him.
Doug
Lloyd. Yeah, exactly. So, and he was telling me, because this was back when I was running for office, and we were having a conversation about cannabis and just marijuana charges in general. And he was saying that there was almost no one in Michigan who was still in prison for solely cannabis-related reasons.
Right.
Is that true?
Yeah.
That is true.
It is true.
Okay. And there are so many people who are like, that's absolutely not true. There's this person, this person, this person. And Doug was like, pump the brakes. He was like, there were other factors involved. Like, yes, they were in for cannabis, but there was also a weapons charge. There was also an assault. There was something else. Just solely cannabis, there's no one left.
Exactly. So when you look at that, and that's a good point, you brought up a weapons charge. If you commit any felony with a weapon, a additional charge is added onto that called felony firearm, meaning you committed that felony with a firearm, and that gives you an automatic consecutive 2-year sentence to whatever you get on the first one. So let's say you did that and you had cannabis, right? No big
Even
deal.
if you weren't violent,
right.
But you had a weapon.
But you had a weapon.
Yes. Okay.
Because the tendency is there, the opportunity to use that weapon and become violent, right? Whether you're going to shoot someone or they're going to rob you with a gun. I mean, there's a lot of different factors that could play into. But we really don't see people convicted of drug cases go to prison very often.
Yeah.
At all.
We need to do an episode on this.
Okay.
We need to do an episode on this. We should jump back to finishing up the Bowman case, but it would be fascinating to talk about this in depth, just because people's perception of how it actually works is completely different. Because I know people personally who think there are thousands of people still in prison for, just selling like an eighth of weed.
No.
And it's like, that's not true.
No.
See, okay, we'll jump back into that. So,
just real quick, you asked me if I could tell the legislators what I would change. One of the things that I really want them to do is think about not only the defendant's rights, and don't get me wrong, those are important, but think about the victims. How does this affect them? How does this affect their families? Because oftentimes it seems like with all of these legislative changes lately, whether it's regarding bond, people get out very quickly, they're eligible for parole, different kinds of things. it feels like the victims have been forgotten, and I would just like to remind the legislators to think about them. And if they need a reminder, I'd be happy to talk with them about all of the victims and all of the things I can't get out of my head that maybe needs to be stuck in theirs when they make these decisions.
Yeah, we should take a deeper look into the second look law?
Second look legislation.
Yeah, we should take a look into that and just see if there are exceptions for specific types of crime. And then if they aren't, I mean, I'm sure we can get one of the groups that we both work with to, go after some legislators related to this.
I'm hopeful there are some exceptions, but like I said, once I got past the first couple paragraphs, I was really, really, quite honestly irritated. So I set it down.
And so you saw a rat and you're just like, get this away from me.
Yeah.
Like, okay. So to jump back to wrap up the Bowman case or cases, what does justice look like for the victims and society when a criminal is sentenced in 2 states?
So in these circumstances, we have 2 victims. We have Kathleen and we have Aundria. And both of them, both of their families, both of their friends who love them deserve to have that finality, that understanding of, we have done everything we can. We've figured out who did this. The person has been accountable. And each of those victims and their families and friends deserved that justice, that Bowman be convicted of both cases. Now, it's always important to make sure, like we've talked about numerous times throughout this episode, to make sure that your cases are done accurately and by the book so nothing can be overturned. But by having convictions in 2 states, if for some reason Bowman were to ever appeal either the Virginia convictions that he pled to, by the way, or the Michigan conviction, again, that he pled guilty to or no contest to, you have not necessarily a fallback, but you have something to hold on to in case for some reason one of those got overturned. You'd still have those convictions that keep this monster incarcerated for the rest of his life.
So it's wise to have as many and in as many places as you possibly can, just in case some type of evidence has to be thrown out. Like you had mentioned in the last episode, if one piece of the evidence gets tainted and they're all connected to each other, it all has to be tossed.
Yeah. But by Bowman pleading in both of these cases, it cuts down the right to appeal. They can't necessarily appeal all of those things anymore, but they can appeal how the plea was taken. They can appeal the sentencing and a few other things. Or if they think they have a really good reason, they can appeal by leave. What that means is they'd have to have the appellate court say, yeah, I think you have a novel question, an interesting question of law that we do need to address, but we don't see that happening.
Yeah. So in this case, there's just no chance.
I don't see that happening.
Yeah. Do you believe that justice is truly served with prison time, or do we need to rethink what punishment for violent criminals should look like? And I know some states do. I mean, if you have the death penalty, I mean, that's looking at it in a different way, but just in your personal opinion.
Virginia does have the death penalty, and they initially charged Bowman with that. But when he pled, they took the death penalty off the table and gave him life sentences instead. And that was certainly their call to make. I guess I'm on the fence about that. I don't think Bowman should have luxuries while in prison. I don't think it should be an easier life. Yeah, they're incarcerated and they can't see their family and friends, but I don't think they necessarily should be entitled to extras. Should they be able to watch TV or movies or other types of things? I don't know. I wouldn't think so. Aundria can't do any of those things. There's a whole series of things Aundria can't do and Kathleen can't do as a result of his actions. So why should he benefit? Why should he be able to do the things he took away from them?
I think people would argue that it's because you'd like to be humane. Just putting someone in a cell with no form of entertainment just to sit there. I mean, that would essentially be like solitary confinement almost.
They can talk to other people. They can read books. They can learn. They can take classes. But why do they need TV or movies?
So you wouldn't take those things away. You would just take specifically like...
Well, it depends on the person.
So you would.
It depends.
Yeah.
But I do think that there are a lot of things out there that maybe they shouldn't be entitled to. If they want to better themselves, great. Take some classes. Do some other things. But the entertainment piece, that's the word I think you used, I don't think they should get entertainment.
That's interesting. Do you believe that in cases like these two cases and with monsters like Bowman, death penalty should always be the route to take, or do you think it's worse to be in prison for the rest of your life?
I'd like to think that it's worse to be in prison for the rest of their life. I don't think Bowman regrets any of the things he did. He doesn't seem like he does. His words, his actions don't show that he has any remorse or regret other than maybe getting caught. But I do think that, it's hard on him. He's not where he wants to be, and he deserves that. He can't see his family and friends in person, and he deserves that.
He's in hillbilly hell.
He's in hillbilly
And
hell.
he
That's what
deserves
he
that.
called it.
Yeah.
It's exactly what he deserves. During the sentencing, when we make those arguments about what we feel as prosecutors the sentence should be, we look back at the investigation and we try to pick out some quotes and some different types of things that the perpetrator said along the way that shows their mindset, shows really how horrible the things they did was. And I found one that I want to share with all of you. So this was during a phone call back in February of 2020 that Bowman had with Brenda. And this is when he is basically confessing initially where the body is.
And Brenda's his wife.
Brenda's his wife. He says to her that she's been under your nose the whole time. He says Aundria is 3 feet down in a hole that I dug, and that his quote was, "Brenda, you would just not stop bitching about where Aundria was. Now you know, and you can put her in a tin can on the mantle. Now you know what a rotten son of a bitch I am, and that I've been lying to everyone, including you." That's pretty powerful when that's a statement he made to his wife about all of this. There's no remorse in there. There's no regret. He just got tired of his wife bitching at him, wanting to know if you were involved, where is she?
And he's talking about his daughter.
Exactly.
He's talking about his daughter. I mean, personally, I don't know how people like that should. I don't know. It sounds evil sometimes to just say that those types of people should be killed. But what else do you do with a human like that? I don't think there's any rehabilitating someone like that. I don't think there's any helping. Like, the sickness is just so ingrained in who that person is.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way to rehabilitate this murderer at all. And that's one of the purposes for sentencing, is to rehabilitate. But other purposes of sentencing are also for the protection of society, for punishment of this particular offender, and also to deter others from doing the same or similar things. Those are the three I focused on during this sentencing. Those are the three that I used, that quote that I just read, to show the court he didn't care what he did. He was just tired of being bitched at and wanted his wife to stop.
You talked about Aundria in terms of nevers. Can you explain sort of what that means?
So during sentencing, there's something called a victim impact statement, where the victim, if they're still alive, can give a statement as to how this crime impacted them, or family members can give a statement. And in this case, I spoke for Aundria at the time of the sentencing. And I talked about a lot of different things. I talked about what he did and how he did it. I talked about the dismemberment. I talked about the deception and the manipulation of the case from the very beginning. But I also wanted to humanize this case, and I wanted to give Aundria that voice. So I wanted to speak in terms of things that she would never have a chance to do. And so what I said was, in this case, Aundria lost her life, her potential, and was given only a series of nevers. She would never go to prom or graduate high school. She would never go to college and find a career that she loved. She would never get married or have children of her own. And she would never enjoy growing up and growing old, surrounded by those family and friends who love her. You know, it's interesting. This has been a couple of years since I did this sentencing, and I have the quote in front of me to make sure I got it right, but it's still so ingrained in my head, all of the nevers Aundria won't get. And it was all because of what Bowman did. He silenced her permanently.
Yeah, it's incredibly impactful when you put it in perspective like that. And then to tie it into what we were just talking about before, Bowman is still alive. He still has some pleasures and entertainments, and so I'm questioning you saying that those should be removed, and then you hear something like this, and it makes you second guess and revert back to, you know what, maybe you're right. Fuck it, take that stuff away from him. Like, he made it so she can never have any of those things. Like you said, she'll never go to prom. She'll never have a family. She'll never have kids. She'll never be able to experience life, in the way that many of us are. And it's all because this monster took it all away from her.
Exactly. And, there's a series of nevers for Kathleen Doyle as well. Now, she was married, but they were a young married couple. They hadn't had or started a family. And I'm sure there were things she wanted to do with her life and deserved to do with her life that she wasn't able to. There's a quote from the Netflix documentary that I believe it was Kathleen Doyle's aunt said, and she mentioned that Dennis Bowman is superfluous to Kathleen's story, other than the fact he took her from their family. She wanted the focus to be on Kathleen and all of the positives and the good and the love that she gave, not on the way that her life was ended.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good point. Again, that's why I don't want to use his name. I'll call him the defendant or the murderer, because he shouldn't have the respect to be given that name.
And you had mentioned that early on, and I've called him Bowman, and maybe we should just refer to him as a murderer. But everyone or anyone who loses their life at the hands of another human, they all have those nevers, right?
They do.
I mean, it's overwhelming to think about.
It is overwhelming, and it's very sad. I looked at a slew of pictures of Aundria from when she was little, when she was older, and some taken right shortly before she was murdered. And I just think this poor girl was 14 years old. She had no support. She had no one that believed in her to keep her safe. And I think that's the reason, it's one of the reasons I continue doing what I'm doing, is I want to make sure victims like Aundria and others have that voice. And if it has to be mine or another prosecutor's, then that's how it has to be. But we need to make sure that we protect these victims as much as we can. Even though we couldn't protect her before she was murdered, I still see it as a protection after she's gone.
I think that's a great place to wrap up the Bowman cases. Is there anything else that you'd like to touch on before we answer some questions and then move on to another case in the next episode?
I think we've hit on so many of the details, but like I said, in preparing this case for over 2 years, I have so many details in my head of this case, of things we've talked about, but a plethora of others that we just simply don't have time to go through everything. But I'm really excited to hear what the questions our listeners want to know are, and hopeful that if they have more as a result of these next episodes, that they let us know so we can answer them.
Yeah, so I just chose 4 questions that we got. We got about 11 questions. Some of them were like similar questions, and some of them I've just condensed because they were longer. So the first question was, what is the psychological profile on Bowman? And the person had asked that because they wanted to essentially know what's the best way to like spot these types of people or behaviors so they could, keep their family safe, essentially. And I don't even know if being on the lookout for that stuff or, creating in your head that, some type of behavior from an individual in your life means that they're going to commit these types of acts. I don't know if that's safe or dangerous, because then some people they're seeing the boogeyman where the boogeyman isn't sometimes. So in your opinion, what is the psychological profile on Bowman, and should people be aware of these traits and tendencies that certain individuals have?
We didn't have a full psychological workup or profile on Bowman. We had bits and pieces from different cases over the years we had to piece together. We know about the alleged intermittent explosive disorder. We talked about that previously. But there was also in a prior report, it's called a pre-sentence investigation before someone is sentenced. In a prior report for one of his prior crimes, it discusses that he was assessed by a psychologist. And this psychologist allegedly made a comment in whatever their discussions were that the best secrets are those you keep to yourself. So I think Bowman took that to heart and realized the best secrets are the ones you keep to yourself and don't tell. In Bowman's case, it was really hard to come up with that psychological profile for people to see these red flags as he was doing these things because he had another side. According to Brenda and their daughter, he had a side that was loving and caring and a good dad and husband, which I just struggle to believe knowing everything else, but that's what they say. He also went to church. He taught Sunday school. He had, people in the community that believed him, people that he worked for, other types of things. So I think it's difficult necessarily to say in hindsight, oh, we should have seen this red flag or that red flag, because he put up so many roadblocks to all of that it was difficult to see through to the horrible monster he really was.
So it brings up a thought in my mind, just about Aundria coming forward and trying to tell people, you think he's, all of these things. He's the great dad. He's the, guy who goes to church every Sunday. He teaches Sunday school, all of these things. But I'm telling you that he sexually abused me, and then not having the support and then recanting.
Can you imagine the strength that this 14-year-old child must have mustered to come forward and say, hey, this man who's all these other things in the community and church and whatever else is sexually abusing me and has been for a period of time. She had no support. Her mom didn't support her. Her adopted mom didn't support her. Friends did, but again, there's only so much teenagers can do to be supportive.
Yeah.
So it must have taken an incredible amount of strength for her to come forward. But if you think about it, I think it took an incredible amount of strength for her to recant, because she knew if she recanted, she'd have to stay in that abusive relationship in that house that was abusing her, where he was abusing her. She'd have to stay, but she was protecting her little sister because she was afraid it would happen to her.
Yeah.
And I've heard that same thought and theory from so many victims over the years. They felt that they could deal with the abuse as long as it didn't happen to somebody else. But what they don't realize is that just gives the perpetrator, the monster, more, not ammunition necessarily, but more of a reason to keep going, because they got away with it with you, and now they're going to move on to somebody else.
Yeah.
And that's really sad.
It's incredibly sad. And I guess just to wrap up that question, it's one of the reasons why when, especially kids come forward with these claims, you should take it seriously.
Right. You absolutely should. Children in Michigan now are given what's called a forensic interview. It's done according to specific protocol, generally at a children's assessment center. You've got a multidisciplinary team of experts who are there making sure and vetting out what happened, how it happened. Is there any reason that this child would make this up? Is there anything else going on we need to know about? But children need to feel supported, and they need to feel protected. Aundria didn't have either of those things.
Yeah, and that actually ties perfectly into the next question, which was a forensic interview ever done on Aundria's sister?
Aundria's sister at the time she went missing was about 18 months, 2 years old, and so that's pretty young to be able to do a forensic interview. But over the years, the Bowmans shielded their biological child from the investigation and everything else. And even as an adult, she didn't believe that he had done any of these things, probably up until the body was unearthed in their backyard where she grew up.
So to jump to the third question, and it ties back to that second look legislation that you talked about. The question is, Michigan is close to passing a second look law. What impact will that have on victims of violent crimes? And I know you touched on it earlier, but I just want to make sure that we're respecting the question.
So victims have that sense under truth in sentencing, knowing my perpetrator got a sentence of, let's just say, 10 to 15 years. They know at least for the next 10 years, there's not a chance that person's going to get out. So that gives them a chance to heal. It gives them a chance to grow up in a lot of cases. It gives them a chance to move away, maybe from the location where these things happened. It just gives them time to process what happened to them. If that's taken away and they get a sentence, say, of 25 years, but under this second look legislation, again, depending on what the exceptions may be for that law, victims won't have that safety and security anymore. They're not going to know if they walk around the corner, I might run in to the monster who did these things to me. And I just don't think it's fair to them. Again, I think the law focuses only on the defendant and their rights and not the victims, and that's wrong.
And I think that we're going to look into that and get more details on that and probably put it into a future episode just so we can be sure like what's being proposed.
I'll go back and read it, and I won't put it down this time.
Thank you. And then the last question, and the question that we got the most of, so we had several people reach out asking if there was an easier way to connect with help than, searching your prosecutor and finding a number and making a call to someone. Like, people were just wondering if there was like a more direct way to get to exactly who they need to get to.
I saw that we had several questions asking for one direct number, and the difficulty is cases go according to where their jurisdiction is, where the crime happened. So that's across the board, across the state, across the nation, and it depends where you live, what your jurisdiction will be. And so the best description we can give is to reach out to your local law enforcement if it is a situation where it's ongoing and it's happening and you need safety. If you're not safe, reach out to law enforcement immediately. But if it's something that you are safe and you still need to report, but you don't know where to go, or maybe you're just reaching out for services or treatment or counseling or therapy and you don't know where to go, I would offer that if you reach out to us at Behind the Verdict and send us a message, I will make sure I find somebody that you can connect with so you're not having a hard time and you're not dealing with it on your own.
I think that's great. And just to reiterate one more time, if it's an emergency, please reach out to law enforcement. But if it is something that you do have a little more time and you just don't know which direction to go, as Myrene said, we'd be happy to help you find resources and point you in the right direction. So with that, we will wrap up this episode. And if you have any additional questions, we'd love to hear from you. Please message us on our Instagram page at BTV_pod. And if you enjoy the podcast, please rate us and leave a comment.
We love reading the comments. It gives us a great idea of how we're doing and what your thoughts are, but also your questions. So if you have additional questions, remember, I have a lot more details on this case I'd be happy to share. I just want to know what you'd like to hear.
You can find us wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.